Welcome to Marney Reid Presents Connect to Develop, where we provide insight from healthcare leaders on the hottest topics and trends. Hello, listeners. This is the first of a four-part series with two industry-leading experts to discuss the state of the union of spine and orthopedic practices, housekeeping items that private practices and departments should consistently attend to, the anatomy of a private equity partnership if your group or department looks at exploring that option, and various key items to incorporate or watch out for before and after signing a letter of intent. In today's episode, we'll unpack what's happened this year in the world of spine and ortho practices, look at the second bite transactions, discuss the new orthopedic platforms in the industry, and review this trend of joint ventures between previously unlikely entities that are starting to occur. I'd like to introduce Dana Jacoby, CEO and founder of Vector Medical Group, who brings insight and experience from over 2 decades working in healthcare. She spent the last 10 plus years assisting physician groups and departments with market strategy, including advising them during private equity deal assessments and transactions. Hey, Dana.
Hey, Marnie. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited about talking to you.
Absolutely. And Gary Herschman Esq, member of the law firm Epstein, Becker, Green. Gary brings over 30 years of experience and hundreds of transactions with physician practices to the discussion. He works with practices and hospitals on consolidations and new partnerships or affiliations. Hi, Gary.
Hey, Marnie. Thanks again for having me on this great podcast series.
Dana, a lot has happened since Academy in February, so catch us up. What's been going on in the mergers, aggregations, and acquisitions market for both spine and ortho?
Yeah, Marnie, it has been a very, very busy year. You know, in quarter one, when we were talking about a lot of this at the Academy and at AAOE, in quarter two, we just hadn't seen a lot of the recent mergers close yet. And frankly, a lot of people were digging out from the holidays and trying to figure out kind of what this year was going to look like. Since then, we have had multiple private equity transactions with new private equity groups in the orthopedic and spine space and neurosurgery space, believe it or not. We also have had some surgery companies or some large-scale national surgical firms investing in orthopedics, which is the first time that has happened. And we also have some new strategics at the table that are about to be second bites. So it's really interesting to see some of the changes. I think I was telling you and Gary pre-podcast, just, the interesting thing about heading into the Academy this year is we have a lot of new news that we just didn't have last year. So it's very exciting times. There's a lot of new energy against mergers and acquisitions, and also what does the future of 2024 and 2025 look like for orthopedic and MSK groups?
Gary, whenever I talk with physicians about why they're talking with private equity, there's a lot of emphasis both from the tenured and new partners about this second bite. Can you share with our audience who maybe isn't familiar with the term second bite, what that actually is?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it always is something the doctors are confused about and have uncertainties in their mind as to what happens several years down the road. So a lot of these 20 or so orthopedic platforms, let's call them, that are out there now consolidating orthopedic practices are basically financed by private equity platforms. And private equity platforms basically are investor groups that have basically money from very wealthy people and pension plans and institutional investors. And those are there, we'll call them limited partners, they call them LPs. And they've provided all this money to the private equity firms to do this consolidation. And the second bite is usually somewhere, 4 to 6 years down the road, where they built this big company and consolidated practices and have this common corporate management platform that benefits everybody. And it's a standalone company, and they basically sell their equity in the company to a new investor, usually a larger private equity company, or sometimes a big, like Dana said, national strategic company that buys the whole company or invests substantially in the company. This allows the original private equity investor to cash out their proceeds, give returns to their limited partners, those investors in the private equity platform. And in those transactions, the doctors usually get a significant return on their rollover equity, because when they join one of these platforms, they get cash plus equity in the platform. They don't get totally bought out unless there's doctors that are about to retire, but other doctors take cash out and maybe, let's say, roll 50%. The rules vary, but in general, they take out significant cash and continue to roll equity. That's the second bite transaction in a nutshell.
I can understand why it's such a hot topic. So, based on that, are we seeing the projected second bites, this anticipated, I think we call it the multiplier, right? That much larger buyout the second time. Are we seeing the projected second bites with those practices who are nearing or at that stage?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen in the market is what I'll call COVID interruptus, which is, there were a few of these platforms that had started looking for their second bite transactions towards the second half of 2019, and then COVID hit in 2020, and that kind of put a hold on everything in terms of second bites. And I think it took some time, but I think finally now, this year, 2024, we're starting to see a lot more activity, and we expect, from what we understand is going on in the market, that there could be 2 or 3 exits of those orthopedic platforms by the end of this year or the first half of next year. So not yet, but rumored to be happening very soon.
Is there anything that physicians, at any tenure of their career need to be prepared for in this new era? And I love the term that you used. Any watch-outs?
Well, in light of the new environment, I think, with different tenures of physicians, when I speak with groups, I always tell them that it's the younger doctors, the doctors in their 30s and 40s, that are set up to make more money in the long run, because doctors in their, mid to late 50s or early 60s may experience one second bite transaction, Marney, but there could be third bites and fourth bites after them. And that's happened in, the dental arena, the dermatology arena with private equity, ophthalmology. We've seen, third bites and fourth bites. And so that, the real benefit from that are really the younger doctors.
Dana, you and I very recently were at a dinner with surgeons who were just trying to understand PE in general and in healthcare. And it was staggering to me when you were mentioning how many PE players there are in, derm versus, dental and everything. So I hear there's new players in the ortho market. Can you tell us who they are, what moves they're making, and what does this foretell for the next 12 months with PE and musculoskeletal deals?
Yeah, Marty, it's interesting. I mean, using the dentistry or dermatology or ophthalmology industries as examples, to Gary's point earlier, that those groups have all gone through first bite, second bite. Those were kind of the grandfathers of these deals. The MSK and orthopedic market are fairly new to private equity. We just had our first, private equity transaction in orthopedics in 2017. And then nothing really in 18, nothing really markedly in 19. We all know what happened in 20 with COVID. And then there's now over 25 different platforms. There's a couple of new entrants into the private equity space coming. There's 5 different private equity groups looking for new investments in MSK right now. But also there's going to be some larger private equities that are going to be a part of these second bite conversations that Gary's talking about. So you kind of have a bunch of new entrants, Marnie, not to mention a handful of strategic players as well. There's, Optum is looking at some investments in orthopedics, Surgery Partners, which we can talk about strategically because they just came into orthopedics with a big Wisconsin acquisition. They were not in orthopedics up until 2024. So you're watching a lot of change happen with new entrants coming in, not just in PE, but also some strategics that are thinking, hey, this is a really good opportunity for us to invest in MSK and spine because of things like the ambulatory surgery market and the ability to aggregate a bunch of doctors for supply chain and for economies of scale. So really interesting time. I think you're going to see between now, and you can put this on record, but between now and March of 2025, you're going to see some announcements around some really interesting new entrants, both on the private equity side and on the strategic side.
It's funny how several years, kind of pass by eking along, and then there's this explosion. So Gary, can you talk about options? Because I'm also hearing some murmurings that employed doctors or doctors in PSAs with hospitals have that I don't think they were looking at or thinking about before.
Yeah, Marty, that's a great point. There doctors who are employed by health systems or under professional service agreements or PSAs with health systems and hospitals, I think historically thought, oh, I'm on the sideline here. But there have been transactions in orthopedics and other specialties recently where, I don't know, I could call them separations or extractions, where a group under a PSA or a group of doctors in the same specialty employed by a hospital decide they're not happy. A lot of them are happy where they are, but others aren't happy. And if they're not happy and they want to kind of get into this consolidation activity, they can. And we've worked with some groups that have PSAs that have negotiated deals, private equity platforms, and then they negotiate the deal and then they give the notice of termination under their PSA. And their deal closes once that notice period's over and they've separated from the hospital PSA. And the same thing with groups of doctors, like, orthopedic surgery doctors, within a hospital not being happy and negotiating a deal where a private equity platform will kind of spin them out, if you will, or extract them and set them up in an office and cut a deal. And once the deal is cut, they would then give notice, everybody at once, whatever it is, 90 days, 180 days, whatever their contracts require, notice of termination. And you have to be careful and look at non-competes and things like that. But for the most part, the hospitals want the doctors to continue in the community and continue to use the hospital, because not everything can be done outpatient these days, although more can be. So there's definitely an opportunity for doctors in those situations to get into this activity and better their situation if they're not happy.
So I pose this question to both of you because, I've heard of all of those scenarios before, and I'm not going to ask any of you to violate client, privilege, but is there a world where employed physicians and either private equity or strategics, as you've mentioned before, like the Optums and the Surgery Partners and the USPIs, could all come together in a big joint venture? And if so, what would that look like?
Marney, I'll step in. I think everything is on the table right now, depending on what region and what geography you sit in. If there's any, advice we could give to some of your listeners, it's not a time to sit on your hands and decide you're not going to partner with anybody or not create strategic alliances with anybody. If you're an employed doctor in a health system, there's options for you, and you should be looking at all of your options. I think you and I are both aware there's certain doctors in health systems that are happy, and there's certain doctors in health systems that are not happy. And before they go renew a physician services agreement and just double down on a relationship, they may want to look at all of their different options. That's not something that says you should break up with your hospital, but there are some players coming in to the space that are willing to do joint ventures, private equity included, by the way. There are private equity groups that are coming in with a thesis that they want to partner with health systems on things like ancillary services, ASCs, et cetera. So I think everything's on the table. I think that a lot of the prior conversations where you're an independent practice or you're private equity backed or you're hospital. And now with some of these new entrants and new mentality, we're seeing things shift where you could be multiple things and still win. And so I think it's a good opportunity for doctors to really get educated about the players in the space and what the changes are happening. It's very different than the conversation we were having in 2021 and 2022.
Yeah, Marnie, just to add to that, I see the knee-jerk reaction of the doctors wanting to get out of these hospital relationships as being very negative. But I think that they're starting to come around. Like when ASCs started to proliferate 20 years ago, hospitals were very upset, that they were going to lose, surgeries to these ASCs. But in the end, over time, they partnered with USPI and other SCA and other national surgery center management companies. And I think what we're seeing now is the same thing. If you can't beat them, join them. And that this is where things are going. And if doctors want to be affiliated with private equity platforms, maybe there's a role for the hospitals too, if they're employed by the hospital, and to be part of the ASC that they might be building together. And otherwise, like Dana said, be partnered on ongoing directorships and on-call coverage and other programs together, so that it's not just us and them, but it's a joint venture together. And we're starting to see those more and more.
Absolutely makes sense to stay on kind of that, post-COVID world, all of these different things coming into the market. I think, Dana, I think health systems are starting to think about market growth from a different lens, especially as they saw working capital getting eat up so quickly, when all these elective procedures had to go down. So if a health system with employed doctors were to enter into a joint venture with PE or another strategic, what key factors would need to be in place before and after this partnership for it to even work?
Yeah, I think, Marnie, everybody has to be open to the conversation. And we've seen some health systems that are open to it and other ones that are not. And it's not a knock. But, I think it really depends. Again, I said this earlier, on the geography, on the payer situation, on the culture. We have some doctors that I have a situation right now. The doctors have a phenomenal relationship with their health system, and they are looking at alternative options for growth of their ancillaries, and everyone is at the table in that conversation. And it's been awesome to see the health system leaders be able to have that conversation openly with the doctors. It's just creating a transparent lens for the future. We have that in a couple geographies right now. In other situations, we don't have that. And so I think everybody has to be very realistic about what that looks like. I agree with Gary. It shouldn't be this negative, us versus them, we're getting a divorce. It's more about really, how do we look at the future of our geography and create the best patient outcomes and the best payer strategies. If you talk to some of the health system CEOs off the record, behind the scenes, specialists are very expensive. Building ambulatory surgery centers or other ancillaries in different specialties, whether it's OBLs and cardiology or labs, it's expensive. It's hard. Running specialty-driven healthcare is difficult. So if there is an opportunity for folks to partner, it can be very good. But it really starts with the people, the relationship, and the culture. You can't just all of a sudden come in and say, hey, we're bringing in private equity or we're bringing in a surgery partner. It has to be a very thoughtful approach. But we have seen some things, especially in other specialties that are the precursor for ortho, where that's happened very strategically. And it's actually a win-win for everybody when that conversation is open and transparent, assuming you have that relationship already.
Absolutely makes sense. Well, Dana, Gary, fantastic updates, insights, and what's next, and looking forward to the next episode.
Great. Thanks, Marnie. We are too. We're so grateful to be able to have this conversation openly with your podcast.
Thank you very much.
For anyone listening who'd like to request a complimentary town hall, either in person or via webinar with Dana and Gary to unpack these topics, or even discuss your practice or department situation, please email info@vectormedicalgroup.com to schedule a time. You can also register for their November 8th, 12:30 p.m. sponsored session at the upcoming 2024 Annual AAHKS Meeting titled Private Equity and Orthopedic Groups, where they'll discuss the latest updates, pros and cons, second bites, and life after closing. Check out the show notes for more information about this upcoming session and for that email address if you didn't catch it the first time. Thanks for listening to Connect to Develop. You can find more interviews and Marnie's Minutes on my YouTube channel at Marney Reid Presents.